You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 317, Peace Commissioners. Ever since the French and American victory at Yorktown in October of 1781, all sides seemed to be moving toward a conclusion of the war. The negotiations of the terms of that ending the war dragged on for years. Back in episode 309, we covered the fall of the North government and the establishment of a new government under Lord Rockingham that was ready to recognize American independence. Of course, things are never that simple. Shortly after Rockingham became Prime Minister in early 1782, an influenza epidemic spread through London. Rockingham became ill and died on July 1st. Before his death, Rockingham had put together a coalition of opposition groups to replace the North government. His death led to a schism of that coalition, but before we get to that, let's look at what Rockingham set up. He had appointed two Secretaries of State. One was William Petty, better known as the Earl of Shelburne. The other was Charles James Fox. Although both men advocated an end to the war and an acceptance of American independence, they did not get along. Fox's father had been a political opponent of Shelburne a few decades earlier and had politically supported William Pitt the Elder over Shelburne after the 7 Years' War. So the Fox family had a political gripe with Shelburne. Beyond that issue, the two men had a very different vision for Britain. Shelburne was a member of the House of Lords. He did hold many forward-thinking ideas. He was an early advocate of free trade and had long-standing relations with men like Adam Smith, Benjamin Franklin, and David Hume. At the same time, he was also a member of the aristocracy and always wary about putting too much power in the hands of the commoners. When the North faction had greatly weakened following the fall of the government over the issue of the Revolution, Shelburne's chief rival was Charles James Fox, who was the other Secretary of State in the Rockingham government. Fox was the son of a baron, but he was not the eldest child and was not going to inherit a title. Instead, he began a career in the House of Commons. I've talked about Fox a great deal in some of the very early episodes of this podcast. He was very active politically in the 1760s. He gravitated toward the Tories and had been a leader in the campaign to punish the radical John Wilkes. He also made a personal fortune while he was Paymaster General of the Forces. Lord North had appointed Fox to the Board of the Admiralty in 1770. He only sat on that board for less than a month. Fox resigned out of opposition to the Royal Marriages Act, something again that we talked about really early in this podcast, but this was an act that was very important to King George III. However, the act would have raised questions about the marriage of Fox's parents, so that's probably why he took such a strong position against the crown. Despite this split in 1772, Lord North appointed Fox to the Board of Treasury. Once again, though, Fox resigned after a short stint, this time just over a year. After this resignation, Fox began to associate more with the opposition. He worked closely with men like Edmund Burke. When the Revolution began, Fox became a leading advocate for the colonies and was one of the most vocal opponents of the North government. When Lord Rockingham died in 1782, Shelburne was the one who became Prime Minister. Fox, of course, greatly opposed this move, and he resigned from the government once again. He went back to the opposition in Parliament. Several other Fox supporters, including Edmund Burke, also left the government and returned to the opposition. Now, despite this departure of the Fox faction from the British anti-war coalition, Shelburne still held on as Prime Minister. He pressed forward with the primary reason that he came to office, that was ending the war. Shelburne appointed Richard Oswald to begin negotiations with the Americans. And this appointment actually came while Rockingham was still the Prime Minister. Shelburne, as Secretary of State, appointed Richard Oswald to open up those negotiations. Oswald was a commoner. He made a life for himself as a Scottish merchant, and quite a good one. He made a fortune as a military contractor during both the Wars of Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War. Over the years, he invested much of his wealth in land. He owned estates in Virginia, Georgia, and East Florida, and he had business contacts around the world, including India and China. During the Revolution, Oswald had been a strong advocate of a stronger military crackdown on the colonies. He had advised Lord North to send overwhelming force and impose ruthless punishments on the rebels. Still, Oswald's reputation as a dealmaker appealed to Shelburne. The two men also had a desire to maintain a relationship with the new United States and perhaps reach some solution that did not result in full independence. Oswald had a long-standing relationship with one of the American negotiators. He and Henry Lawrence had been business partners in the slave trade for several decades before the war. In fact, Oswald had put up the bail that allowed Lawrence to be released from the Tower of London. Oswald had also corresponded with Benjamin Franklin in the past, although the two men did not know each other very well. Shelburne sent Oswald to France to begin negotiations in the spring of 1782. This was just about as soon as the Rockingham administration took power. Fox, however, was concerned that Shelburne and Oswald would drag out the negotiations in an attempt to avoid having to concede complete independence. So in response, Fox sent his own emissary, Thomas Grenville, to go to France as well. Grenville was the son of George Grenville, the minister who, again, we talked about very early in this podcast, the minister who had pushed through the stamp tax back in 1765. Now, the younger Grenville had been an officer in the regular army. He never went to America, and he resigned his commission in 1780. He had taken a seat in the House of Commons since 1779, when he was only 24 years old. As such, he hadn't had much chance to make his mark politically when Fox sent him to Paris. Grenville was a full half-century younger than Oswald, who was in his 70s. The two agents seemed to have very different personalities and very different political agendas. As you might guess, having two secretaries of state sending two different peace commissioners with different instructions was not really a good start for things. The reason for this, in part, aside from their political differences, was that Shelburne's authority covered diplomacy in the Americas. Therefore, he had the authority to negotiate with the Americans. Fox had diplomatic authority over Europe. Therefore, he had authority to negotiate with France, Spain, and the Netherlands. Oswald showed up at Benjamin Franklin's door in Vassy, France in April. He had a letter from Shelburne making clear that he had the authority of the British government to begin negotiations. He also carried a letter from Henry Lawrence making clear that Oswald was a good guy that you could talk to. Franklin and Oswald talked over dinner, informally, getting to know each other and trying to discern each other's positions. Oswald was very vague over the details that a final treaty might take. He made clear that the ministry wanted peace, but also had to be assured that the terms were not too humiliating to Britain. Sending a negotiator to speak directly with the American diplomats was at least a good start, since it recognized the U.S. as an independent country. Franklin, however, saw the danger of Britain trying to divide France and the United States. The U.S. had agreed with France not to negotiate a separate peace, so Franklin made clear that French Minister Vergennes would have to be included in any talks. A few days later, Oswald accompanied Franklin to Versailles, where both men met with Vergennes. The experienced French diplomat put on a pleasant face, but also made clear that Britain would have to establish terms that would end the war for all four combatants: France, Spain, the Netherlands, and the United States. Oswald pressed Vergennes to give him a framework of what peace terms would be considered acceptable, but the Frenchman demurred. He said Britain should put forward a proposal for peace that would be considered by the Allies as a group. A few days later, Franklin and Oswald met again. Franklin had written a letter to Shelburne saying that he would be happy to work on negotiations with Oswald, but that Oswald needed authority to negotiate a wider agreement with all the countries involved. As usual, Franklin was firm but pleasant. He also thanked Shelburne for the government's decision to release American sailors being held in British jails and arranging for their return to America. Those prisoners had been starving to death, literally. Traditionally, the U.S. was responsible for feeding prisoners in British custody. This was the norm throughout Europe. If your men were taken prisoner, you as the country that was still commanding those soldiers would have to take care of their food costs. Parliament hoped that their release would be taken as a gesture of goodwill, which it was. During this meeting, Oswald broached the idea of going beyond peace and establishing some sort of reconciliation between the U.S. and Britain. Oswald did not say at this meeting, but he and Shelburne hoped to keep the U.S. within the British sphere of interest and avoid having the U.S. develop closer ties with France. Franklin countered with the concern that Britain had inflicted so much damage on America that any reconciliation would have to include compensation for harm done. Franklin continued that perhaps Britain could turn over all of Canada to become part of the U.S. as part of that compensation. Without an enemy border between the two countries, perhaps a better relationship would follow. Probably to Franklin's surprise, Oswald did not reject outright the idea of turning over Canada to become part of the U.S. Instead, he simply took notes on their conversation and said that he would discuss the proposal with Shelburne. To sweeten the deal, Franklin suggested that if Britain turned over Canada, the U.S. might be willing to compensate loyalists who had been stripped of property during the war. This would allow both sides to heal and begin developing a better working relationship with one another. Oswald's opening gambit of offering Canada to the U.S. was a bold one, and one that might have been more of a feint than a real offer. Oswald was still trying to divide the U.S. from France in the negotiations. By offering a generous peace to the U.S., Britain might get the U.S. to go along with a separate peace that angered France. Creating such a rift would force the U.S. into a close alliance with Britain in order to have naval protection. It was a way to make the newly independent United States effectively dependent on Britain. By contrast, France wanted Canada to remain British. That threat to the north would compel the U.S. to form a closer and long-standing military alliance with France. With the commencement of negotiations, Franklin thought it proper to gather the other American commissioners in Europe to negotiate the terms of a final peace. He wrote to John Adams, who was in Amsterdam. Adams had been negotiating with Dutch officials and was also seeking cash loans to keep the Army and the Continental Congress from falling apart. Adams had been, let's say, an interesting choice as a diplomat. He was well known for not getting along well with others. He had a no-nonsense, hard-charging New England lawyer attitude, and he quickly grew frustrated by the subtleties of European diplomacy. Adams had originally come to Europe in 1778 when America was trying to get France to agree to an alliance. Adams replaced Silas Deane, who had been fighting with fellow delegate Arthur Lee. Congress recalled Deane to America after Lee had sent the delegates accusations of Deane's corruption. So when Adams arrived in 1778, he immediately did not get along with either Franklin or Lee. Since Franklin had already finalized an agreement with France before Adams arrived, he did little and returned home the following year. Frustrated, Adams vowed to return to private practice and never get involved with government service again. Less than a year later, though, in 1780, Adams agreed to return to France to serve on the delegation that would negotiate the treaty that was going to end the war. Shortly after his arrival, Adams sent a direct letter to Vergennes castigating France for not doing enough to win the war. An angered Vergennes ceased all communications with Adams, forcing Franklin to write a letter to Congress saying that Adams was actually harming negotiations with France. As a result, Adams left France for the Netherlands, where he would spend 2 years mostly trying to get loans for Congress. He would have little to show for his efforts by the time he traveled back to France in the spring of 1782. Franklin also wrote a letter to John Jay, who was in Spain. Congress had sent the New Yorker to Europe in 1779. Despite the fact that he was only 35 years old when he left America, Jay had already established himself in the American leadership. The young prodigy had started college at age 14 and began work as a law clerk after graduation. He became an early member of New York's Committee of Correspondence and attended the First Continental Congress at age 29. He spent the war engaged in politics, drafting New York's Constitution in 1777 and serving as the state's Chief Justice. 2 years later, he returned to Philadelphia as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress and was almost immediately elected president. When Spain entered the war in 1779, Congress called on Jay to serve as minister to Spain. His goal was to get diplomatic recognition of the U.S., financial aid, and establish trade agreements. Like the other American diplomats in Europe, Jay mostly met with frustration. Spain refused even to receive an American ambassador or recognize American independence. King Carlos III had entered the war as an ally of France. He was not, however, keen on recognizing American independence, since there were so many Spanish colonies in America that might be inclined to follow that example. As a result, Jay accomplished rather little in Madrid other than a relatively small loan. After receiving Franklin's letter about the opening of peace negotiations in France, Jay packed his bags and left for Paris. Another member of the American diplomatic team in Europe was Henry Laurens. He was another former president of the Continental Congress, and before the war had been one of South Carolina's wealthiest merchants. He sailed for Amsterdam in 1780, hoping to secure loans for the Continentals. The British captured his ship at sea and carried him as a prisoner to London. Laurens spent nearly 2 years in the Tower of London, while the government debated whether to put him on trial for treason. Instead, after the British surrender at Yorktown, officials released Laurens on bond and allowed him his freedom. While on bond, Laurens remained in England. He went to Bath for a time to help restore his body, then returned to London, where British officials wanted his opinions on the best way to end the war. He dined regularly with Lord Rockingham and other members of Parliament who very much valued his opinions. When Shelburne became Secretary of State in the new Rockingham ministry, Laurens advocated successfully for the release of those 600 American sailors being held prisoner in England. In April 1782, Shelburne told Laurens that John Adams in Amsterdam had told officials that Americans were ready to negotiate a separate peace without France. Laurens said this could not be true. He received permission to travel to the Netherlands to get to the truth of the matter. When Laurens left for the Netherlands, he traveled with his old friend and business partner, Richard Oswald, who was on his way to meet with Franklin in Paris as the British emissary. The two men traveled to the Netherlands together. Oswald then continued on to France, while Laurens traveled to meet Adams. There, Adams assured Laurens that the American delegations had no plans to establish a separate peace with Britain. Even the offer of receiving Canada could not cause them to break the French alliance. Even so, the trip caused French leaders to distrust Laurens even more. They believed he was acting on behalf of British interests to encourage the American delegation to break with France and establish that separate peace with Britain. It did not help that Laurens and Oswald both returned to London together a few weeks later. Part of the reason for his return to England was that Laurens was still trying to bring an end to his legal troubles there. Although he had been released, and it seemed that Britain did not want to pursue any charges, they hadn't been dismissed either. Part of the reason for this is that Laurens did not want to accept a pardon. That would mean he would have to concede that he committed some crime in the first place. Eventually, the two sides worked out a deal where Laurens would be exchanged as a prisoner of war with General Charles Cornwallis. Although Cornwallis had already returned to Britain at this time, he was technically on parole until he could be exchanged. Finally, in May 1782, Laurens left Britain for France to join the American Peace Commission in Paris. The final member of the American Peace Commission appointed by Congress was Thomas Jefferson. The Virginian, however, never made it to France before the final treaty was signed. Jefferson had left government service in 1781 after losing re-election as governor of Virginia under a political cloud for his pathetic defense of the state against the British invasion. Early in 1782, Jefferson's wife Martha was very pregnant with their second child. She would give birth that spring, but had continuing health complications, and Martha would die later that year. As a result, Jefferson remained at home in Monticello. He mostly spent his time developing his plantation and writing a book that would later be published as the Notes on the State of Virginia. As a result, Jefferson declined the appointment to go to Paris and refused to leave Virginia. So that's a brief outline of the men who are going to be negotiating the terms of peace for the war. Next week, we're going to take a closer look at the efforts by Britain to undercut U.S. goals in the treaty, as well as the efforts of some members of the Continental Congress to undercut the American peace delegation. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, Michael Mulhern, and the Sons of the American Revolution. Be sure to check out the Sons website at fastfunhistory.com. Thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Anthony McGinnis, Greg Pusak, and 10 Crucial Days. You can learn more about 10 Crucial Days at 10crucialdays.org. I also want to thank Edward Denaro for a one-time gift via PayPal. I really appreciate everyone who helps to support this podcast financially. Also, a quick reminder, if you're not in a position to make a direct contribution to the podcast, you can still help by using one of my book links when you do your shopping at Amazon. If you use the link, then just buy whatever you're going to buy anyway. I get a small commission. You don't need to buy the book that you link to. Every little bit helps, and I do appreciate your support. In this week's episode, we discuss the men who were going to hammer out what would become the treaty that finally ended the war. It's interesting to me to note how divided Britain was, even on the ultimate goals that it wanted in ending the war. Now, the Americans were also pretty divided, and we'll get into that more next week. They were, however, concerned about making sure that they retain their commitment to France, not to end the war without France. Britain seemed to be trying to divide a wedge between them, and the reason for this wedge wasn't just to divide their enemies and get a one-upsmanship in the treaty negotiations. Britain was looking for a way to develop a better relationship with the U.S. and keep America within Britain's sphere of influence over the long term. I hope it's no spoiler alert to point out that Britain's initial proposal of turning over Canada to the U.S. did not materialize, and we'll get into more about that next week. But it is interesting that British-American relations really did not grow close until Britain spun off Canada through its Commonwealth program in the 1860s. The two countries would maintain some relationship, but there were often tensions over border issues and other matters, mostly because of the British presence in Canada. It was the reason that America fought a second war with Britain in 1812. Now, since Britain and the U.S. are such close allies today, it's hard to remember how difficult relations between the two were in the early decades of the United States. Now, there's also a famous painting by Benjamin West, which was supposed to include all the American and British delegates who negotiated the Treaty of Paris, and I've posted a copy of this on my blog. The painting is famously unfinished with only the American delegation. The painting includes Jay, Adams, Lawrence, and Franklin, as well as William Temple Franklin, who was Benjamin's grandson and was serving as an aide during the negotiations. Now, I've heard two different reasons why the British delegation refused to sit. One was that they did not want to commemorate what they viewed as a loss. The other one was that Oswald, who was in his 70s at the time, was badly scarred and wearing an eye patch, and he just wasn't comfortable with the way he looked, and he also didn't feel well. He would actually die the following year. In fact, Benjamin Franklin didn't sit for the painting either. West drew him from an engraving that he had, and the painting was not particularly accurate. It was supposed to commemorate the signing, but Lawrence and Temple had both left the country by the time the treaty was actually signed. While the painting was never completed, the treaty was, and that's what really matters. My book recommendation this week is A Diplomatic History of the American Revolution by Jonathan Dull. This book goes beyond treaty negotiations, looking at all of the early American diplomacy and its impact on the course of events in Britain and France. The book is relatively short at about 200 pages and has been criticized as rather dense. The author's last name, Dull, might contribute to this as well. It's unquestionably on the academic side of history books, but it does include a great deal of interesting information on this critical topic. The author, Jonathan Dull, is probably best known for his work on editing Benjamin Franklin's papers, and he's written several other books on similar topics. If you're interested in the diplomatic aspects of the American Revolution, get a copy of A Diplomatic History of the American Revolution. Now, there are also several older books on this topic that are available online, and one of them is my online recommendation of the week. This one is The Diplomacy of the American Revolution by Samuel Bemis. This book was first published in 1935, which means it's in the public domain and freely available on archive.org. If you look it up on that site, there are several copies that are a 1957 reprint of the book that are available as borrow only. I've, of course, included direct links, as I always do, and my direct link goes to the downloadable one that you can access. Links are on my blog and website. My question this week comes from Bob Schneider, who asks, I'm reading Jean Edward Smith's book on Grant. I've noticed when he gives battlefield casualty stats, they are precise and he doesn't question them. In contrast, you give the official number and then often greatly modify it to what you think the actual numbers are. Does that just reflect different approaches, much more accurate numbers for the Civil War compared to those for the Revolution, or something else? Well, Bob, casualty records really probably were much better in the Civil War than in the Revolution. In both wars, officers had to submit reports with casualty numbers. These are often what are reported by historians. The Revolution, however, had many battles fought largely by militia who really didn't keep good numbers. In battles where there were both continental and militia or state soldiers that were fighting, sometimes records include all the casualties, sometimes the records include just continentals. As a result, we have a wide variety of estimates, and they vary greatly. On the British side, British officers deliberately undercounted their own casualties in battle, knowing they could explain the difference later by claiming men had died from disease. I've read many Revolutionary War articles where historians go deeply into research to explain why casualty estimates are wrong. In many cases, they deliberately ignored reporting militia or Hessian casualties, since they knew British officials in London would not pay much attention to those anyway. Keeping their own casualty rates low, while often exaggerating the casualty rates of the enemy, simply made them look like better leaders. When counting casualties in either war, you have to remember that a great many of the wounded would die in the following weeks due to poor medical care. Civil War care was better than Revolutionary War medical care, so the casualties probably had a better survival rate, but it was still pretty bad when you compared to the 20th century, once doctors understood more about infections. That said, there are also often estimates of battle casualties in the Civil War that vary from official estimates. Even in that era, there can be problems with the numbers. I think my approach is different from many historians. Many just give the official numbers reported and assume that is probably in the right neighborhood, even if it's not 100% accurate. While I'm on the topic of casualties, I've also been taken to task by some listeners for sometimes saying the word only, as in the Continentals suffered only 10 deaths in a battle. I've been told this is insensitive to the lives of those who were lost in the battle. I suppose it's true that we have a certain emotional detachment from the lives of those lost, and there may be the implication that only a small number of deaths is not a big deal. I view this as more in the perspective of, while any death may be a tragedy, war is going to involve a large number of them. If fewer people die in a conflict than we might have feared or expected, then using the term only makes sense. This also reminds me of a Civil War song called All Quiet Along the Potomac. That was originally written as a poem after the author had read that headline in a newspaper, All Quiet Along the Potomac, with the subheading, One Picket Had Been Shot and Killed. The song is about the fact that a single death is a tragedy, even if there was not a larger battle with thousands of deaths. That song, All Quiet Along the Potomac, later inspired the book set in World War I, All Quiet Along the Western Front. Now, if you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on Twitter, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.